Good afternoon and welcome to the final HBI 2021 session, the adult care panel session. A major sector in the UK and the Nordics, and of course the USA, long-term adult care has traditionally been dominated by the public sector in Europe. This is changing, however, and growing. Fragmented markets have created consolidation opportunities, and we've seen some good deals so far this year. Demand is steadily on the rise, but how will operators cope with the critical staff shortages, underfunding, regulations, and the lack of level playing field between public and private providers, but also between Europe and the UK? With me today, I'm delighted to welcome Andrew Cannon, the Chief Executive of Voyage Care. Voyage Care has been around for 13 years, delivering care at 600 locations across the UK, providing special support to over 35,000 people with learning disabilities, autism, brain injuries, and complex needs. And the company employs 11,000 people, right?
Yes, it's
Welcome.
3,500 people we support rather than 35,000.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you.
Nice
Thank
to
you.
have you here. And remotely, directly from Sweden, Magnus Åkerhielm, division manager at Nitida, is joining us. Nitida is a subsidiary of Ambea and one of the leading disability care companies in Sweden with 450 locations nationwide. The company supports people with learning disabilities, mental health care problems, and addiction, but also runs special schools for children. Welcome, Magnus. Can you hear us?
Thank you, and good afternoon from a bit rainy and cold Stockholm.
Nice to have you. So, as in the previous panel session, I would like to start with a COVID-related question. We've seen that COVID introduced additional regulation and policy changes in adult care, some of them contradictory to each other. So how did it affect your business, Andrew? How do you cope with this complex new normal, and will this complexity lead smaller operators, let's say, to sell?
That's a really good question, Zena. Yeah, it's been a very, very challenging period, as you might expect. We're quite lucky in that the client group we provide care and support for is working age adults, that's 18 to 65. Yeah, the guidance, I can only talk about the UK, but what we saw was guidance coming out often several times a week, often contradictory, often really late on a Friday. I think this is where, for me, scale is really important in this space, and this is where scale has a particular role to play, because if we've invested really significantly in our central functions, in our quality teams, so we have more good and outstanding services than anybody else in the UK. There are a whole host of reasons for that, and I could talk about that for hours, but one of the reasons is that we have a very effective quality team that takes complex guidance and regulations and distills it into really straightforward processes and procedures and policies. And having to do that on a sometimes near daily basis or react to that very, very quickly was extremely challenging, and continues to be quite challenging. How you would cope with that if you were a small provider, just an owner operator, and for those of you who don't know this space very well, the specialist care sector, about 50% of it is owner operators or more and par type providers. Very, very fragmented sector. We're the largest registered provider, and we've got about 4 or 5% of the market. So yeah, I don't know how smaller operators coped with that changing guidance, with that changing regulation. And your suggestion that will that lead to more of them exiting the market, we are already seeing that. So one of the features that we're seeing today is, one of the investment hypotheses you might have for this sector is you could consolidate it. It's really fragmented. You can do lots of roll-up acquisitions, and you can build something of even bigger scale. A few years ago, we tried to test that hypothesis by building an internal team that would make outbound calls, that would contact people, services that we wanted to buy, that were good or outstanding quality, that were in geographies that we liked. And we really struggled. We really, really struggled with it. But what we see now is charities exiting the sector, charities. We see have particularly struggled with charities who might be doing fundraising or raising awareness, seeking to influence policy, being thought leaders, are struggling to run and maintain good or outstanding provision, which compromises their kind of broad strategic mission. We're also seeing now lots of smaller providers coming to us sort of unilaterally and saying, would you like to buy us? We're thinking of exiting the market. So we've actually got more opportunities than we can reasonably cope with at the moment in terms of inorganic M&A. So yes, that seems to be the way it's going.
That's interesting. Magnus, do you agree?
It's interesting to hear you, Andrew, because there are many similarities with what we saw in Sweden. First of all, I think it became obvious very early during the spring of last year that Sweden was not prepared for a pandemic. We were late as a society, late in the start. Maybe not so strange when exposed to something new as a pandemic. But I also think that the Swedish society is not made for crisis. It was a very long time since we were at war. When I look at my history, I think we have to go back to 1814 when Sweden invaded Norway. So it's more than 200 years ago when we actually faced something similar to this. But we had very much the same challenges as Andrew described. A big challenge for our organization was to adopt and to comply to all new regulations that were sent out. Sweden is divided into 21 regions and 290 municipalities. And Nytida, having business with over 200 municipalities, it became very difficult for us to obey to all these new authority, regulation and laws. And it was not uncommon for these authorities to have different views and also contradictory views. So a key player within our group was the quality department that was given the main task of reading all these new regulation and instructions, and then really go through them and see what are the changes, what needs to be communicated to the organization. And I think that maybe was one of the greater tasks during the whole pandemic, is to really to list what is different in the new regulation compared to the past. And I also agree that as a large company, we were able to handle the pandemic much better than many of our smaller competitors, just based on the size of our support organization, and having also a larger organization where you could pool employees, having employees to work in other units when needed. If you had high sick leave, or if you have an outbreak of COVID, for example. So I think we, as a large company, were able to handle it better. And then, of course, coming back to your second part of your question, it's too early to say if this will lead to small operators selling. I don't think so, but if the pandemic will continue, then I think there will be a lot of small companies that would look into leaving the industry.
Thank you, Magnus. Speaking about M&A's consolidation, we've seen that in childcare, a lot of private equity interest is approaching the industry. Given that adult care market is very fragmented, will we see any private equity interest shifting towards adult care in the near future? What do you think, Andrea?
It's a really good question. I think I think it's a really interesting space. I love working in it. I feel very blessed to have the opportunity to work in it, to make the difference we do. I think from a commercial investment, it's really interesting, and it has a number of characteristics that would make it interesting for different investors. So if I think about Voyage Care in the UK, a very stable client group. So our average length of stay in our registered business is 11 years. Our occupancy today is 93.6%, 94%. If you'd looked at our financial performance from the outside during the course of the pandemic and you didn't know there was a pandemic, you would conclude nothing had happened. We just continued on. And that reflects the fact that the care we provide is a statutory obligation of local government in the UK. So extremely, extremely resilient. There isn't a substitution, there isn't an alternative. This is lifelong care for people who have very, very severe and very profound needs. So there's high barriers to entry as well. So I think, for lots of investors, they'd look at that and say, high barriers to entry, opportunity to consolidate it, really stable. The other thing is, I suppose we're growing very well. Our organic growth year on year is 8 or 9%. That's organic. That's without M&A. I guess other investors might be looking for something more dramatic than that, or might be looking for something different. So I don't know. It would be. I think it's a very, very attractive sector, and I think it's one which plays a vital role in society, and it's always going to be here. And the demographics, one where the demographics are on our side as well. So it's a sector where the volume and the rate of fee growth means it's going to grow at about, depends who you believe, somewhere between 5 and 7% annually. So yeah, I guess that makes it a very, very attractive investment. But I'm in it. I enjoy it for different reasons, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. How about Sweden, Magnus? Is the industry attractive to the private equity investors?
I hope so, because we also had a good year in 2020. In fact, I think we had our best financial year ever, Nytida, increasing our EBIT operating margin by 2 percentage points to over 16% last year. And the market, the underlying market is growing in Sweden. I think the demand for more support for people with disabilities increase. We have it's growing because of the population growth in Sweden, but we also see an increasing mental illness in the society, and that is not only in Sweden but also in Scandinavia as a whole. So I see the potential and for growth, and also see that there should be a level of profitability that could be attractive going forward also.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let me jump to another issue. I'd like to talk about funding issues in the sector. Is funding sufficient as we dare to hope for an end to COVID? And to what extent can political response and budgets for adult care change with the years to come?
Do you want me to have a go at that?
Yeah.
Funding's okay. You'd always like more funding, right? I think the recent announcements about social care are broadly helpful. We're waiting for the details of that plan. I think one of the things that's been helpful through the pandemic is placing the role of social care at the center of people's, closer to the center. I wouldn't say the center that overplays it, but closer to the center of people's thinking in the UK. I think it's taken an awful long time, but I think there's an increased awareness of the role that it plays and how valuable it is and the difference it can make. And I think that can only be helpful in the long term. I think that sentiment is really, really helpful. I think it's also helped raise awareness of the different shapes that it comes in. So people prior to the pandemic, I think, just thought about social care as supporting older people, old age care homes, sort of thing. And I think that people now have realized that it comes in, there's all sorts of different things. And of course, the space we're in, working age adults, is actually a larger share of the public purse than elderly care now in the UK. So the funding is okay. If I'm being honest, what we do is, I feel a bit unkind saying this. We get more than our fair share, and what that means in practice is, if you're a really small operator, and you're providing, because the settings are typically a lot smaller, you're providing care for 5 or 6 people, and you're competing against a Voyage Care who's providing care in the same geography for 200 people. Voyage Care is going to get to speak to the Director of Adult Social Services and negotiate the fees and make sure that we get a good settlement. And the smaller owner-operators or the individual providers are not going to get that opportunity and don't have that leverage. So again, this is a point where scale plays a role, where quality plays a role. So funding's okay, funding's going to increase. It's broadly helpful, but the thing that we've become very good at is being commercially, I'd say commercially strong and getting more than our fair share.
Mm-hmm. Great. Magnus, how about Sweden?
I think the funding has been sufficient. If I look in the back mirror, if I look at the Swedish care market, I think it's growing with about 4 or 5% annually, which is a sign of strength. But the big question on my mind is really what will happen now when we are coming out of a period of almost a year and a half with COVID. It's going to be very interesting to see on how this COVID has affected the municipalities. It's too early to say how they have handled it. The vaccinations are ongoing. And the society is slowly getting back to the normal. But personally, I foresee a stronger demand from the municipalities, which will be good for us as a company. What we have seen during the pandemic is that many clients has been reluctant to change living during COVID. They have been scared. They have maybe stayed in their old living. Maybe the children has been staying with their parents and so on. So I feel and I hope that there will be more so to say changes and more demand here in the coming months. That municipalities need to handle. And in Sweden also, funding is one question that is debated, but there is also an ongoing debate to ban profit-making companies within care. And this is a debate that has been going on for years. But it's up for debate at the moment, and we also have a parliament referendum coming up next year, and that election will certainly be about care, not so much about funding, but how it should be organized, and it's good to see, and on the positive side is that all political parties in Sweden agree that care now after COVID must be allowed to cost more. So when it comes to funding, I'm fairly positive, that must say.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Magnus. Do we have any questions from the floor so far? No? Okay, I'll give you some time. I've got a question regarding labor shortages, actually, which is a very trending issue in social care lately. So, Andrew, how do you reconcile the competing forces, let's say, of low levels of funding, kind of, because we discussed that funding is okay. And also COVID burnout, mandatory vaccination in the UK, and Brexit as well. Having all of them, isn't it the perfect storm, let's say?
Yeah. I mean, I'd rather not have them. Let's see. Well, I'll speak about it from our, well, I can only speak about it from our point of view. I think out of the ones that you said then, the one that most concerns me today actually is COVID burnout, as you described it. The fact that people have been working for 18 months in what's been really challenging, rapidly changing guidance, rapidly changing ways that we work. Access to activities has been significantly reduced, so changing practice and course, you think about the people we provide care for, have people who might have severe autism, who are used to, routine, really, really important, and lots of those have been denied to them. So it's been very, very different. It's been very difficult. The other things for Voyage Care are less of a concern. So we have very few non-UK EU nationals, less than 4%. That's a feature of the geographies that we operate in. It's not by design. It's just where we're placed in the UK. And we've never been able to compete on wages with lots of other kind of retail or hospitality. So we choose not to compete on that. We choose to compete on something different. We choose to compete on giving people a role where they can make a difference to people's lives, where at its best, it's a wonderful job where you have fundamental impact on the way people live, and it can be challenging. It's not for everyone. We work really, really hard to recruit people with values that match the values of the organisation, and that's not easy to do, and it means that lots of the pool of labour that might be available to others is not easily available. But how that's manifested itself is, before we came into the pandemic, one of the measures of your staff stability is how much agency you're using, how much temporary staff are you using, and we were using about 2.5% to 3% of our care hours were agency, were temporary staff. Through the course of the pandemic, that got down as low as 0.5%, which is sort of unsustainably low, really. It's a practical flaw. And we're now back up at 2.5%. So we're back at the levels we were pre-pandemic. So, yeah, I mean, the mandatory vaccination has not been, we've worked really, really hard at that. So we've done things like we've employed, not permanently, a professor of virology from Leeds University to do Q&As, do kind of help people, support them, deal with all their questions. And you can imagine we had a really wide variety of questions, but he was super good and super patient. And we've just gone through it and targeted people and worked on people, and we found it a lot easier, I think, than others might have done, because of the nature of the people that we recruited in the first place. And so actually our staff turnover is improving. Our attrition is reducing, actually.
But how about, what do you hear from other operators? How about the total market?
I think it's really hard. People are having to work much, much harder. And I think people are talking about things like safe staffing levels, which is we don't talk about that, but that's like talking about limiting somebody's life where you're just doing the basic stuff. And for me, that's heartbreaking. That's not where we should be. So yeah, it isn't easy. It's really, really tough. And those factors combine to make it, people are going to have to work really, really hard. But I mean, we hit in the previous session, I think it's going to ease up. We're seeing it easing up already, certainly in terms of the applicants that we're getting and people coming off furlough, etc. So I'm always kind of an optimistic guy. I feel quite hopeful. I think the next few months it'll bounce back.
Okay, thank you. Magnus, I understand that vaccination in Sweden is a personal responsibility, and actually you don't have that big understanding issues. But how different are the rules in the Nordics? And when it comes to adult care, why do we lack this level playing field between EU and the UK sometimes?
It's a good question, and coming back to the way that the Swedish government chose to handle the pandemic, I think a big difference compared to many countries is that in Sweden, when it came to COVID and vaccinations, we as a society largely worked with recommendations from the government and with very few new laws or rules. And it's the same goes for vaccinations. There are no specific rules for vaccinations, not even for people employed within care or in hospitals. So for staffing, there are no different rules if you work in the public or in a private company. The same rule applies. when it comes to COVID, recommendations, use of PPE, and so on, vaccinations. There are all the same rules, if any, so there are no differences. The only difference that when it comes to private and public companies, when it comes to COVID, is maybe that the public companies have received more compensation for cost increases due to COVID. And that's part of it, that they are part of the municipalities' organizations, where we have received some, but not as much compensation as the ones from the municipalities. But the way I see it, the big difference and making it not a playing field when I compare to the public companies is the process we have to go through when we need to establish a new organization, if we are going to approve managers, and it's really the approval process to do business within care. Where we as a private company are obliged and need to go through very lengthy processes and also very expensive processes in order to get the permits. And this is something that makes it not so much a level playing field between private and public companies.
Thank you, Magnus. What's your opinion on the lack of level playing field between UK and Europe, Andrew?
Yeah, I think that the UK thinks differently about the public services that it wants, and there's a huge amount of nervousness around the NHS. So you look at take mandatory vaccinations. So vaccinations are mandatory in a registered social care setting and not in the NHS. So it was entirely foreseeable that people would leave social care settings and go and work in the NHS. I mean, that would have, if anybody in this room was discussing the kind of anticipating the problems, that would have been like the first 10 minutes we would have talked about that, right? So I think it's because of the way people in the UK and politicians in the UK think about, firstly, the NHS, and secondly, kind of tax regime and what's acceptable. There's also it came up in one of the previous sessions, Nick Sanderson from Audley was talking about the way that people in the UK think about their homes and home ownership and passing that on. So for me, there's a whole collection of different societal attitudes about tax, about home ownership, about the importance of the public health system that underpin those different attitudes and those different ways of operating, really.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do we have any questions from the floor, maybe?
James with HBI. You were talking about M&A earlier, and you were talking about smaller companies who are looking to be bought up. How easy is it to integrate a smaller company into a much wider group that have been sort of built up with their own idiosyncrasies?
Yeah, that's a really good question, James. It depends. Yeah, that's a really boring answer. Sorry. It depends is the short answer. I think companies of a certain size, it's something. I think it's reasonably straightforward actually for smaller companies, and the reason is one of the key areas for growth in this sector is tenders and winning frameworks. And when you win a large tender, it's not really that much different from buying a small organization. You have to tube your staff over. You have to integrate it to your ways of working. You have to roll out your policies and procedures. You have to sort out the billing. I think I look at companies that do other organizations, and I won't name who they are, that do a series of larger acquisitions and often construct kind of logical fictions about what that means in terms of the pathway. And the thing that I really worry about is how effectively they've integrated those acquisitions. And just to be really, really boring for a moment, because there's only a dozen people in the room, billing is incredibly challenging, because in the UK, when you deal with publicly funded clients, if your payers are local authority, every local authority has a different way they want you to bill. So Liverpool will say, log onto the portal. Manchester will say, we'll pay you quarterly in arrears. Newcastle will say, we'll pay you monthly in arrears. Brent will say, we'll pay you whatever. So you end up, if you've got a national footprint, you end up with 250 payers and mass bespoking going on in your billing. So when I look at two larger organizations being put together, this is really boring, but the work that has to go on in terms of working capital, in terms of billing, in terms of cash flow is horrendous. So I think once you get to real scale, it's very, very difficult. And then, I mean, I could talk for the rest of the time about this, and then you've got the kind of cultural thing. So the cultural import is vital for us. Purpose is absolutely everything. We talk about our purpose, delivering wonderful care and support and being commercially successful. Landing that culture and sustaining that purpose and reinforcing it is easier in a small group where you just can swamp them basically and communicate and be visible and physically there. With a larger organization, it just takes that much longer. I think it would take several years, you know. So yeah. Sorry, James. It depends is the short summary of that boring answer.
I can give a perspective also from my side, and also having a financial background and having done several acquisitions in the past. Size is one parameter, but also what I think is interesting, or you need to know, is really, is this a new service or is this a service that you already know a lot about? Because my past is really, when you integrate new services, you need to be much more careful. You need to really stay focused on integration and not letting them, so to say, come too far away from the core that you are doing. If you have the services already, then the transition of small companies integration goes fairly smooth, my experience. But really, the hazard is really if you are adding something that is new to the business.
Mm-hmm.
I think, can I say something else as well as Zina? Just to build on the answer I gave James. The other thing is to look for companies where the culture is as close to yours as possible. So we look for organizations that have good or outstanding care, because otherwise turning that culture around is really, really difficult. So if they've got people with good values who are in it for the right reasons, who want to make a difference, that's a great place to start, and that's much easier. So yeah, choosing your targets well makes it significantly easier as well, I think.
Any other questions from the floor? Okay, I've got a question regarding quality, and I think quality is a core of adult care. So how do you measure quality in Voyage Care, Andrew?
There isn't an easy answer to that, and this will be another really boring answer if I tell you. I mean, in lots of different ways is the really short answer. But the key thing that we do is lots of health and core organisations, I'll only speak on behalf of the UK, measure, and I've worked in elderly care and I've worked in health insurance and health acute provision. Lots of them measure what I would call the absence of bad things. So they measure medication errors, unplanned hospital admissions, falls, deaths, that sort of thing. And for me, that's just, well, you or I wouldn't expect bad things to happen to us. That would not be the measure of our life. You know, that's not where you should set the bar. So what we measure is, are people happy? Are they fulfilled? Are they leading a meaningful life? Are they participating in their community as a citizen? Are they voting? Are they in employment? Are they in education? Are they developing their skills? Are they able to cook when they couldn't cook before? Can they shop? Do they feel safe? And that, all of those things sound a bit sort of intangible or ethereal, but the first thing to do is to start talking to people and ask them those questions. And we've done it now for several years, and and we've done it with a really consistent cohort, and it's going to be in, it's going to be published research because it's a statistically significant population. It's over a consistent base of almost 2,000 people. For me, that gets to the heart of what quality is. Are you enabling people to lead a meaningful and fulfilling life? We measure loads and loads of other things. We have a service risk scorecard. We measure manager stability, staff turnover, staff instability, all those kind of bad things, all sorts of stuff you'd expect. But yeah, the thing that we work really, really hard on is measuring things that are hard to measure, but that connect more effectively to our purpose. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but do you think in the UK quality in adult care is improving year by year, or is it stable? Is it improving?
It's so yes is the short answer. If you look at care for people with a learning disability, what it was in say the 70s and 80s, that probably seems like 2 lifetimes ago for you, but I can remember it. If you look at it in the 70s and 80s, people were in dormitories, people were manacled to beds, people would be, we call it chemically coshed. They'd be given antipsychotic medication to manage their behavior just to kind of keep them quiet. So those sort of things are now routinely wholly unacceptable, and everybody knows. So you'd go, well, that's good, isn't it? That's better. I think, is it getting better? I think we've reached a sort of something of a plateau, really, where people's attitudes have changed. But because of the way care is commissioned, because of the pressures on local authorities and health and commissioning groups, people are just doing, I won't say the minimum, but people haven't got the time and the space to think about things that could be really interesting, like measuring outcomes, paying against outcomes. So they just, and this is a kind of a good thing and a bad thing for us, right? Which is we're a really, really high quality provider, so we get lots of business because we're a safe pair of hands, and we're no more expensive than anybody else. So we're better than we were, but we are missing opportunities every day to improve the whole system, and that's the source of frustration for me. I could talk a lot about this.
Magnus, how do you measure quality in Nytida?
We try to do it in a very standardized way, trying to measure and track quality on all our units on a monthly basis, where we actually have an internally developed system, so we can monitor it. And what we do is really we extract the data from the existing subsystems, and then what we have done is that we have selected. I think it's 8 or 9 strategic KPIs within HR and quality where we measure. And it could be short-term sickness. There is a self-assessment where a unit manager needs to answer different questions regarding requirements. We have how the organization, the unit works with improvements. We have a response rate from and ratings from our yearly client satisfaction surveys. So we try to do this on a very structured way, and then we have this report that is issued first week in the month, and the results are shared with all managers and employees on all levels of the organization. And what we see is that actually that the result from the organization is improving year by year, and that leads to that we think that the quality in fact is improving. So we see the link also between quality performance and the cost efficiency and the result. But this is a huge area, quality. So it needs to be addressed and on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Magnus. How about discussing regarding the historical paper-driven adult care moving into a more modern digitized model? Who bears the cost there, and how far has it been developed, Andrew?
Oh, that's a good question. So I was listening to the previous session, and was it Guillaume from WeCare? He said, "Oh, you can't do it with paper," and we're still on paper for the most part. I mean, yeah, we have lots of digital stuff around the organisation, but in terms of our care records, it's on paper, and it represents a big opportunity for us. The challenge that we have is the challenge that we've got a staff team of about 11,000. So any change we make would be a really big, significant one. You know, training people on that and making sure that they're doing it would take a few years. It was a big opportunity in terms of the creation of time and space to further improve quality. Who would pay for it? We would have to pay for it, and we would have to back ourselves to recover the investment that we're making in that time and space. I'm sure that we would do that. The other thing that gives me kind of pause, and we are exploring it at the moment, and we actually have a pilot running, but the thing that gives us pause is, if we were in, I always use these examples, but if we were running a travel agents in the UK, everyone uses one or two systems. Or if we were running hotels, you use one of 3 booking systems. There isn't a standard in social care for an operating system for an electronic care system. It's hugely fragmented. There's loads and loads of different things, loads of startups. And so it's quite a big bet. It's a big investment and a big bet for us, and not without risk. So yeah, there's big opportunities in terms of efficiencies, big opportunities in terms of quality improvements, improving time and space. I mean, it's one of the things culturally we think a lot about. How can we remove the barriers that exist to enable our frontline to deliver our purpose of wonderful care and support and being commercially successful? How can we remove the burden from people at the front line? How do we make sure we don't give them bullshit stuff to do, that doesn't need doing? Sorry, I swore.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Thank you, Andrew. Magnus, have you moved from the paper-driven model to a digitized one?
I for sure, I think COVID has made us more digital, but we have still far to go in Sweden and in the Nytida organization. I hope to see in the near future that we are being able to do more digital work closer to the clients, instead of where I see too many instances when I visit the operations, that you take notes and then you go back to the office and finish it, and where you actually do the documentation by the computer in the office. And also we still suffer a lot from a lack of integration between different systems. That maybe is not historical papers, but it's still a lot of extra work where you need to document, for example, in 2 or 3 different systems. So hopefully we can be more digital in the future compared to where we are today.
Thank you, Magnus. That's very interesting, actually. So we just have 5 minutes left. Would you like, Andrew, to let me know what excites you about 2022 and which are the opportunities going ahead, just to close this session?
Sure. What excites me about 2022? I always feel excited about working in this space and the difference that we make. And I was I did some service visits yesterday. I went to 5 of our services, and met a lady there who was just fantastic and hilarious and wonderful company, and having the opportunity to continue to work in that environment is for me always really exciting. It's really, really exciting. It's like life in Technicolor. So I love that, and I feel very privileged. What excites me from an organizational point of view is we're growing. We're going to be quite a bit bigger. We're going to reach more people. We're going to make a bigger difference in the system and in society. We're going to touch more people's lives, and that's the thing that really, really excites me. I want us to have a bigger impact than we're having at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Do your plans include international expansion?
International expansion.
Yeah.
Well, So, you know, it's funny, one of the things that people often ask us about, or often ask me about, is children's services and moving into children's services, because we don't do it at the moment. We do some complex children's care and we do some complex clinical care for adults at home, but we don't do it. And the reason that we don't do it is because it's a different regulator. I would never be arrogant enough to think that because we're good or have some competency at doing this, that we can do that. So if I'm really honest, I don't know enough about it to kind of give a sense of that. It was interesting talking to somebody earlier on about how a lot of the sectors in markets in mainland Europe are run by charities, are run by third sector providers, are run by the church or voluntary organizations. And I suppose what's interesting and what I'm quite curious about is the space that we're in and the conditions that people have. It's really, really complex. There are really, really high barriers to entry. This is not a space for somebody to do their best or try their hardest when you're dealing with somebody with a really complex clinical condition. So to me, I look at that structure and think, have you really got this? I'm curious as to how they have and maintain the professional expertise to deliver the quality of care that I'm sure that everybody will want to be delivering.
Thank you. Magnus, what excites you about 2022?
What really excites me is coming back to a normal world without having to constantly refer to. So I'm hoping here that the fall will not be any setbacks when it comes to vaccinations and so on. And I really look forward to coming back to the operations, visiting the different facilities and meeting all the operations managers, employees and clients. Because from a Swedish perspective and a Nytida perspective, we have been very restrictive in visiting our operations for precautionary reasons here during the last year. So I really look forward to really being out there where everything happens.
Thank you, Magnus. We have a last-minute question here, but we are running out of time, so I suppose you can catch up with each other after the session is...
I will catch up with Sue Saville of Sue Saville Media. Yes, I will. Thank you, Zina.
Thank you, Andrew. So that's it for today. Thank you for being here, Andrew. Thank you, Magnus, for joining us remotely.
Thanks, Zina. Thanks, Magnus.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.